you want to try to land one in one frame?
What will we make the disaster?
I got it 15.9, give me left traffic runway 21. Okay, what do you need to land? Do you want to try to go to T-Bar? T-Bar, actually, the Lloyd Park guy, emergency email. Package 15.9 on the George Washington Bridge, wants to go to the airport right now.
What's the airport check? Did you need a ticket?
Yes, the third side. Can I enter them in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Captain 15.9, turn right 280, you land runway 1 and 0.
Okay, good.
Okay, which runway would you like at 0?
We're going to be those.
I'm sorry, say again, Captain? Captain 15.9, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up in 2, talking about 7 miles. You 54718, turn left 210.
4101, 4718. I think he said he's going in the Hudson.
Captain 15.9, Pitot.
Yeah, so anyhow, a somber moment for those guys. 121 operation, that's the part the aircraft operation operates under. Federal Regulation Part 121. 209 is the last time we had a fatality in that type of operation. So my math says that's 8 years ago, 9 years ago. Hopefully we can get somewhere with that with 135 and 91, especially in the state of Alaska. If you ever get a chance, try to see the movie. I think it's called Sully. Anybody know? Yeah, Sully. A heck of a good movie. Anyhow, my name's Mike Yorke. I work for the FAA. Dave Swartz, he's with the ACO. Fancy name for that is Aircraft Certification Office. These are the guys who don't give you your 337s. We're the guys who give you a hard time when you do something else, like fly through some closed airspace or issues like that. But we're very, very fortunate to have the Aircraft Certification Office here. A lot of people think when you have all these government entities here that maybe things aren't really good and that there's just too much government around. But these are the people that can get things done for you. That's why we're able to get the land of skis here at Anchorage and get things turned around and improved. Airframes, parts, all those things. These guys are working on those and many, many others all the time. So, external loads tonight, huh? How does this thing work? I think I found it. We're going to try to do something a little bit different this evening. Try to get out at 7 o'clock. So 5:30 to 7, maybe we won't take a break. That way we could get out. A couple things Dave wanted to talk about, some mechanical deficiencies. I'll talk about external loads, and I have some CFIT information for you here. This is a complete interactive session, so if you've got something to say, even you back there, Heather, feel free to say it, speak up, let us know. If you think something could help you out as far as the FAA or the Aircraft Certification Office, speak up, now's the time. It really does not fall on deaf ears. Okay, so we've been through all of that. Okay, Dave put a new picture up there. There we are, different ways to do external loads in the state of Alaska. The one on the, let's see here, the top there, that's a pretty common one we see around the state of Alaska. That's a pretty common one, carrying some lumber on there. This one's kind of not so uncommon, but holds some unique characteristics to it that I'm going to chat with you folks about. Aircraft eligibility. Can't be a turbine airplane, can't be a jet airplane. Got to be under 12.5, got to be a U.S. registered aircraft. Why? That's who we look after. FAA looks after U.S. registered aircraft. Canadian MOT looks after those, and I'm sure there's other folks that look over other aircraft. To haul an external load in the state of Alaska, private pilot is a minimum. 250 hours, minimum flight time, 50 hours in make and model. So if you have 10 hours in a 206, 70 hours in a de Havilland, you probably get 50 hours in that 206 before you qualify. Operate in accordance with 91.313, that's a little bit up Dave's alley because he talks all those regulations all day long, but that talks about restricted category aircraft and how they operate. The fire bombers that you see out here are restricted aircraft category. There's a gentleman here, Mr. Dale, he flew a couple of restricted ones, I guess, C-119 and a U-2. So those are all restricted category aircraft.
one of the more important things about restricted category is if you operate a standard category airplane, then we've certified it, we've done all the flight tests to meet the requirements and the rules, so we know if you're operating within the operating envelope. You'll have control of the airplane, it'll climb the minimum climb gradient, it'll be stable, it'll be able to recover from a spin. All of those things are more or less guaranteed by all the flight testing that we've done. If you're in a restricted category, that's not true. There are at least one rule that has been exempted that we know you don't meet in those aircraft. So to a certain extent, you're a test pilot.
So do we want an aircraft to spin? Yeah. Do we want to be able to recover? Yeah. I'm going to tell you a story here about one that was not able to recover and why it wasn't certified. External load attaching methods, that's probably what we all really want to know today, right? How to put the duct tape to hold things on, things like that, straps, how to tie things on, whether you put things both on the right side, the left side, whether you block the exit, if you're hauling dynamite, do you put it on the outside, you know, all those things where we do. So those are probably pretty important things. Operating limitations and the flight characteristics of an airplane, they do change. This presentation that we're kind of getting ready here to show you, believe it or not, was done about, what, 18 years ago, Mark? By me, not much has changed. I was going to change it all, put a bunch of fancy pictures in and all that. But bottom line is, nothing's kind of changed in that arena on how you attach things to the aircraft and how you can operate them in a safe manner. And I left out some of the guidance over there. That's a fancy word the FAA uses for us inspectors to go about our business to find out whether to issue you something or not, whether to issue an authorization or something like that. And, you know, this is pretty unique. We get this in the state of Alaska. This is nowhere else. Mr. Whipline, I think we all know him, Bob. He's a builder of Whipline floats. He tried to get this in Minnesota, and those folks didn't buy off on that too well. And I think at one time we were trying to do this nationally, but it didn't work, did it, Dave?
Yeah, that may change in the future, but that's still to be determined.
So it is a thing for the state of Alaska. I'm pretty fortunate I get to go to a meeting in DC. Who would ever think they would want to go there? But it's about the charting forum, and there's 80 people there from Lufthansa to Jepson Air Publications. Everybody's there. Aerospatiale's there. All the big makers are there. And they always say, except in Alaska. You know, you guys in Alaska, why do you except in Alaska? Well, it's the good work you guys have been doing out there and doing things correctly that's helped us out. So one of the restrictions is essential crew members only, right? So that doesn't mean that if it's a restricted load that you put Jessica Grant on the outside and put a restricted thing on her. Doesn't mean that you're a bush pilot and maybe acting a little bit out of where you should be. What it means is that you got to have a pilot, right? And let's say you have a load that's pretty heavy or something that needs to be moved around. You sure as heck would want some help moving that. Or let's say it's something that is going to require somebody to kind of keep their eyes on it. And I'll show you there's a couple things in this presentation that you might want to be able to keep your eyes on, see if it moves or shifts or anything like that. So essential crew members. So you can't go to the 206, put a canoe on the side, put somebody in the right seat and say, well, that's my trainee and my kid is in the back and he's training the trainee and this one is making sure that he's watching this. So essential crew members. Anything to add on that, Dave?
Yeah, I think it is important that this is one of these rules that requires a lot of judgment about exactly who is essential and who isn't. We have a lot of flexibility in Alaska to do these kinds of operations, but a lot of people nowadays, especially with smartphones, take a lot of pictures, and if this gets abused, then it jeopardizes the ability to do it in the future. So use that with some judgment. Yeah,
at one time, how long ago, Kyle, back? About 4 months ago, we weren't issuing these. 6 months, I lose track of time.
Well, actually, what's the date on the top?
The 2016.
12th of 2015.
There was a period, a 4-month period there.
Yeah. So these were kind of going to go away here in the state of Alaska. I don't want that. Pretty sure everybody here don't want that. I mean, there's somehow we got to be able to get the dentist chair over to Alexander Creek when it won't fit anything else. So just like anything else, the government wants you to apply for things. So there's called an application process, and this actually happened to be my airplane here that Mike Czar did. So you need to come in and fill out some application paperwork. There's some numbers up there if you're really interested in them. And what you end up at the end of the day is a pink piece of paper called an special airworthiness certificate. You get to keep your original airworthiness certificate, and you have a special. Nowhere else do you get to have two. Crop dusters have a special. The fire bombers have a special. They have a restricted. They don't have both, so you get to keep both, and you get to switch back and forth between one and the other as you see fit.
There are a couple of other places we do it with flight test aircraft, and going in and out of market survey, we sometimes do the same thing, but what we call a split ticket is a relatively rare thing to do.
So, after all that, when do you need an external load permit? Let's take a look at the list there. Game tracking antennas, rifle scabbards, snowshoes, cross-country skis, bear spray. Up in Talkeetna now it's getting pretty popular to take bear spray and attach it to the top of the strut. So let's say you're in the Piper family, you've got two struts up there. They attach it up there at the top of the strut. Kind of makes sense if you think about it. They have some pretty good wide Velcro around it. And if you need something out of the airplane for a bear, I think if there's a bear in the airplane, that's probably not going to help you. But outside, you'd be pretty darn, and it's pretty handy. So that was a good thing. That's something Dave and I found out 3 or 4 or 5 months ago up there. So rifle scabbards, snowshoes, cross-country skis, bear spray, and backpacking frame. If you do put game tracking antennas on there, those are usually somebody working commercially or something that we require a logbook entry. We're going to call that a minor installation. Anything else, you need the pink certificate. So in your cases, you're going to want the pink, you're going to want your standard.
Now, there are some other small exemptions to that if it meets the spirit of these modifications and there's still minor aerodynamic modifications. So, for instance, a GoPro camera, if you don't do anything sort of stupid with the GoPro installation, it may be possible to do a GoPro installation as a minor external protuberance on the airplane as well, even though it isn't specifically enumerated as one of the exemptions in the order. But these ones are specifically said, yep, these can be done as minor. And that means you do not need the restricted category airworthiness certificate.
So, Dave, then anything, let's see, from here on down, that square right there, I don't need anything.
You don't need it.
Game and track packing antennas, a logbook entry, you still don't need the pink certificate. Questions? All right, we talked about it when I do need a permit. So what's pretty popular to carry around is game antlers. I haven't figured that out for the life of me, other than they look cool. You can really just cut them in half, and the taxidermist guy will put them together for you. You can put them inside, but they do look pretty cool on the outside, I must admit. Canoes, boats, those are pretty popular. We've got a couple of pictures. We're going to talk about the do's and don'ts on those. You may think you know them all, but there's maybe a few you don't. Lumber, plywood, very, very common out here at Lake Hood. I just drove by a couple operators and I noticed lumber sitting on their property there, so they're getting ready to do some end of the season stuff. Other items not as identified as minor. We've seen four-wheelers on them. I told you I take a dentist chair once across to Alexander Creek on the 206. Not such a big deal. Outboard motors are common on the outside, and snow machines don't work bad either, by the way. When the airplane is in the restricted category, it is not to be operated for compensation or hire. So you say, well, Mike, how do you tell me that these over here are these operators? So that's something that we're trying to work through. Again, we don't want this to go away in Alaska. So everybody's pretty much working with on it. Essential crew members, I think we beat that to death. Who was an essential crew member and who wasn't an essential crew member? Any questions on that? And I know you had something, Richard.
Yeah, so the not operating for hire, does that mean you can't hire air taxi to haul something out for you?
Why did you have to ask that? That's the right answer. There's some thoughts on that, and there are some people at the FAA actually working very hard on that. When I was in business, and they come over and said, how do you do that? I said, well, I don't charge for the flying, I just charge to tie it on. They said, well, if you're going further, do you charge more to tie it on? And I said, well, sure, I gotta make sure it's tied on further, or more secure. So that's something we're addressing and something we'd like to address. There is no move by the FAA to remove this from those operators because we feel, or certain anonymous inspectors feel that they probably know best because they do it often. And they chat back and forth. And you can bet whether they're flying a 182, a Cessna 206 with a canoe, some lumber, or a dentist chair on it, after you've done your external load, when you get back, you're probably going to talk with the rest of your pilots there. I mean, it's just natural. It's just going to come up. So I personally think it's a good thing. Dave, thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is one of those things that we run into some regulatory and legal and some liability concerns. Some of it has to be coordinated with some of the insurance companies too, because if you're on a 135 and you're doing this kind of operations, there may be insurance restrictions because you're having to put the airplane into a restricted category, and that may violate the terms and conditions of your insurance policy. The aircraft doesn't really care about the color of the airworthiness certificate from a forces and moments standpoint. What we're really talking about here is primarily legal issues. The performance of the aircraft is not affected by the weight of that little airworthiness certificate in the aircraft. It's the legal ramifications of doing these things.
So the de Havilland Beaver, which is a pretty popular aircraft here in the state of Alaska, I think there was a total of 1,586 built. It seems as though there's always 1,586 of them around. But they were actually approved for an external load with their standard airworthiness certificate. So you could put a Grumman 16-foot canoe, square stern, on the back of them, providing you had part number 71-2 attaching it, and the straps were built by Omar's Strap Company, and they had to be inspected every 10 years. That's why you don't see any of them flying around today.
Now, we've also got an example on the Super Cub. We did an STC a number of years ago to put a Mad River canoe on. The interesting thing about it is that when we flight tested it, we were about ready to go take off and we said, okay, let's put the canoe on, and then we didn't have a Mad River canoe, so we actually tied down an Old Town canoe, and it turned out it didn't really make any difference whether it was Old Town or Mad River. But, so there is some discretionary authority, just like an IA can have, if, let's say I'm putting on my axle nuts, and I've got a stainless steel cotter pin, and the drawing called out a CAD plated cotter pin. It's within my discretionary authority to use my stainless steel cotter pin instead. So this minor and major decision that we're making in this is, it's a judgment call that the pilot and the IA are making in this particular set of circumstances. So if my STC says I can put a Mad River canoe on there, and I want to put an Old Town canoe on there, that's probably not a problem. If I have a Beaver and I'm going to put a Grumman canoe on there, maybe I'm going to put a slightly different model number canoe, and maybe my tie-down straps might not be exactly the same, but you may be able to do that within the spirit of the same change in type design. Now, if I get a lot out of there, if I'm abusing that judgment, now we could have a problem. But what that means when we've done this, we actually did a spin test with a canoe on the airplane. So it was a fun program, actually. So the aircraft will recover from a spin with a canoe up to that size. If we get too much bigger than that, then we start to have problems. And we have to start trimming off on the weight balance envelopes and that kind of stuff, and we no longer can make it over that 50-foot obstacle in the published performance information.
So we all know this airplane, right? Cessna 206. But what you might not have known is there's a couple things different on this aircraft. Here's a Pitot Tube. Nose house extended. I'll give a fancy name to it. That's called a super heterodyne Pitot Tube. It's for flight testing. Take a look at the ventral fin here. It's been extended here. The individual that did this was Bob Whipplinger. Whipplinger Floats. And if you take a look at the boat here, Bob's from Minnesota, so I'm sure it's a Minnesota boat. Look at these form straps that were put on here. They were specially built for this. You can tell the attached hard points here are adjustable, so that if your boat's a little bit out of whack, you can still get them in these positions. Well, Bob's idea was just like to have this. He wanted to take that boat, have that, that aircraft, put that boat on it, be able to fly away, put 5 people in, have a nice time, go to your lake, go fishing, and come back home. Just like Dave was talking about the P-18 that we flight tested here. Well, what happened was, Bob says, oh, it looks great, flew great, everything. Airplane wouldn't go into spin. So we know an airplane's got to spin, right? So it wouldn't meet the standard airworthiness. So he couldn't move it into standard airworthiness. So therefore, it has to go to restricted. He can't do that in Minnesota. We can in Alaska. So what Dave's telling you is, be careful on some of these things. Just because you have that little piece of paper, don't mean you're not the test pilot. And
So this is an example of something that didn't meet the operating envelope of the aircraft. So you can probably do it safely, but you don't have the margin of error that you had without the canoe, or without the boat.
pretty interesting. Bob shared that story with me at the house one night. Spent a little bit of time with him. Take a look at that picture. I can see everybody's sharp. Is this boat put on the correct way, or is it put on backwards?
Correct.
Why is it correct? Pardon? Tell me more now. I heard correct. Tell me more.
That's true. Behind it,
You want the blend in forward? How come? Somebody said arrow something?
More aerodynamic.
More drag.
And more drag.
More drag, right?
Yep.
More drag. The car goes down the road right with the nose. It don't go down the road backwards. There's more drag. But what does it do? Take a look at the tail. What makes an airplane stay in the air? Wings, right? What makes it go up and down? This part, the tail. We want it to go up and down. We want it to get off the water. So if you take a look at the bottom one, here's properly how you would put it on. So Bob, when he did it, he did the same thing. He canted that way and he put the nose, square nose forward. Keep this in mind when we're looking at some few other pictures here and some photos. I know last week when the power was out, we had a little session in the parking lot. It was kind of interesting how people had thought maybe some things could be done. But much more aerodynamic that way. That's the nice thing about some of our canoes, especially the double ends. You can haul it both ways. When you start hauling plywood, an outboard motor on the outside, or a four-wheeler, or two moose horns, things can change. Antlers, yeah, I used to call them horn stasis. I'm supposed to call them that.
The other thing about this is if you take a look at this kind of a situation where we're spreading the weight aerodynamically off of this object we've got on the floats, if it's only on the left side of the airplane like this, we may wipe out some of the control on one side, but we still have the other side. If we were going to do this on both sides of the airplane at the same time, we might have an airplane that was not controllable. Even though, you know, we may be able to get away with it with one half because we're only wiping out half or maybe a third of our elevator control. If we do it on both sides, we may have a problem.
So there you go, blunt end force first. Not necessarily blunt end first, but let's keep the tail clean. I'm going to show you in another couple of photos why it's very, very important. Dave, this is a little bit you, so I'll let you carry on.
Okay, so a few years ago when we were trying to take this policy national, we did a good search over all of the accident rate, all the accidents that have happened that are serious accidents where somebody was either seriously injured or killed. And going back to the entire population we have in the NTSB database, we've only had these three. So I would say this is a pretty good safety record given the number of these operations we have. However, we can still learn a few things from them. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is also the most recent. We had an accident out near Rome. It was taking off over actually, let me skip that one because I've got another couple slides. But notice here, He was carrying antlers and a rifle scabbard. There were two sets of antlers, one on the left, one on the right. So we've got blanking over both sides and the additional drag of the rifle scabbard. And notice he was 642 pounds over gross. That's a lot. And of course he was illegal because he didn't have a fixed wing external loads, because a couple slides ago we told you you had to have a little wing thick. Not because it's aerodynamically different, but because it's legally different.
Did he have a license?
Yes, he did. He was actually a pretty experienced and knowledgeable pilot that had thousands of hours of flying in Alaska. Our average pilot in Alaska that has a fatal or serious injury accident is 5,000 hours. This guy wasn't quite up to that, but he was a very experienced and well-respected pilot that had a bad day. Anyway, this one was one of these issues that brings up an issue you might not think about initially. He was carrying lumber on the spreader bars on the 206, and it caught fire. And that had plenty of air blasting through it, and he had a very serious in-flight fire because the exhaust system was very close to the plywood. Now, would you like to talk about this?
I used to own that airplane. No, long story. We had a plywood rack on it. Because you have a rack on, we're going to get to that a little bit. Doesn't mean you have an external loading permit. Dave mentioned something pretty important just a minute ago, the pink piece of paper, how it might make you legal. We've got another slide to show you how that might help you out. Maybe a little bit of time filling out the paperwork, getting that external load and doing it right. If you're carrying an external load and have a problem, might be worth your value. But anyhow, there was some plywood on the airplane. He was up by Canyon Creek. And then Cessna 206 did not have the seaplane exhaust stacks on it that come down and curl around to get away from the diagonals. That's what they're designed for. Just came straight down. And the plywood actually caught on fire, and he ended up in the creek there at Canyon Creek and getting out, a little bit of burn on the airplane, completely burned up. What we used to do to avoid that was just take a piece of aluminum, an old piece of leading edge, just take a screw and screw it on there. No problem. Just kind of a deflector. Easy fix. Effect is I gave him the leading edge.
So a little bit of thinking about what's going on, and think about where the wake of the load is going to go. Think about the exhaust. Also think about the control cables, because like a lot of times floats have got external cables on top. You don't want to jam your control cables. On Super Cubs, where you've got control cables for the ailerons out running up the lift strap, don't wrap bunchy cords around your aileron control cables. Some of these things seem really obvious, but until you go, oh, I forgot about the fact that there's really 1400 degree exhaust gases coming out of that tailpipe, I could catch fire. Some of the insulation can also have this problem because some of it is quite flammable. And even if you put a flame to it here, now you get that blast of air and much hotter air. It can cause a lot of aerodynamic drag, and it can catch fire if you get it hot. No external load permit, and that caused a legal problem for him in the post-accident problems. We don't have a lot of information about this accident. This was a 185 that happened back in 1983. Our database is a little less robust in that. We do know that he had pilots, he had plywood attached to floats, and he suffered a stall spin accident. My guess is that the biggest problem here was weight and balance. Because as Mike added there, 200 pounds of half-inch plywood is only 4 sheets. So that's 2 inches worth of plywood, and you've added 200 pounds.
Pretty minimal.
So if you add a lot of plywood, and you really especially need to pay attention to the center of gravity of that load, because it's being added to the weight of the aircraft. The other thing about external loads that are down low is they'll give you a nose down pitching moment because they create drag. That means I've got to pull harder back on the elevator. The forward center of gravity limit on many of these airplanes is set by the ability to flare on landing. So when I come back, I hit that stop and I don't have any more elevator control. So if I've already used up some of my elevator control because I have a fixed wing external load that is far forward and I'm right at the forward center of gravity limit, remember we certified it to the original center of gravity limit. That's when we ran out of elevator control when we did the flood test, so we drew the line there. So when we put the fixed wing external load down on, now I've got an additional nose down pitching moment and I can't move it any farther back than the stop. So that's why when you're doing fixed wing external loads, you want to try and get the load to the center of the center of gravity. So when you do your weight and balance, which I think you should always do, you want to be in the center of the weight and balance envelope. Stay away from the edges of the envelope because you're a flight test pilot at this point. And when we do flight tests, we always start in the center of the envelope and then start working our way to the edges, and we try and land it and flare and see whether we've got the control to do it. The Super Cub's similar to that. The 182s and many of the Cessnas, it's very easy, especially if you're by yourself, to be out of the forward limit. And then if you put plywood up forward, then you're pushing yourself to the forward edge of the envelope, and you're adding a nose down pitching moment. All of those things takes away your elevator control force. And you're putting a wake over part of your elevator, so you're making it less effective. So all of those things start to pile up, and then if you go over gross, then you've got more problems.
Second question.
Yeah.
On your last slide there, you said every one of those accidents did not have an external load permit. Now, if these 3 accidents had a external load permit, would they have it?
I think they still would have. The only thought is that maybe somebody would have understood a few things.
Okay.
They brought something up that's here in another slide, but 4 sheets of plywood, 200 pounds,
Right.
not much. So I'm going to tell you something. A foot of plywood is 1,000 pounds. That's a foot of plywood. That's not much. So but you take your 185. You're a 210-pound man. You have 300 pounds of fuel. You have a person with you, 200. You've got 1,000 pounds of lumber. That's pretty close to gross. It's not over. And I'm almost willing to bet if you're not too proficient at this, which a lot of our operators are here, you're probably out of CG.
I was just wondering because I was wondering what the permit process is, if there's some kind of a little bit of informational training that goes along with getting one of those permits.
When you apply for a permit, you can talk to this more, but you get to have a discussion with your flight standards inspector about how to do this stuff correctly. And that's the learning piece that goes along with that external load, which I think really does help. The other things that you'll do is you'll make logbook entries every time you do a fixed wing external load, and that's written up in that policy. That you do it with 2 sheets of plywood, and you write down how the airplane. You write down some details in your logbook about how it flew, and then you learn from that. And as you gain the experience, you learn more and more and more, and that mitigates the risk quite a bit. And so, the aerodynamic effect of a pink airworthiness certificate is pretty negligible. But if you're a lawyer, it's pretty important.
Yeah, it's very important.
So this is our most recent, and this is the one we have the most robust amount of information on. There were a lot of things going on here in addition to the fixed wing external load. 2 sets of caribou antlers, most of 2 caribou in the aircraft. 2 people, full fuel, because he had been tankering fuel over and didn't want to leave any behind, so he took off with a Super Cub. 2 people, 1,300-foot runway downwind with some scrubby spruce trees, and did not make it over the trees. Crashed, burned, and was killed. Now you've got several things piling up. The pilot was over 170 pounds. You had a good-sized passenger, 500 pounds of caribou meat, 2 sets of caribou antlers, a rifle scabbard, 36 gallons of fuel, oil, all of that stuff adds up to about 642 pounds over gross. Now, a Super Cub will lift this off of a 1,300-foot strip, but it won't do it legally, of course, but it will lift it. You add the extra drag from the caribou antlers, and it didn't. So the result was a stall spin accident. You want to go ahead and get next?
Yeah, this is pretty revealing here. So we all knew we'd do a weight and balance, right? Sometimes we do one afterwards. It's kind of interesting what the weight and balance tells you. Dave, you drew that up, so I'll let you talk about it, but we know what this is, right? It's called the envelope. And in case we have a little mind lapse there, we're at 1750 for a P18.
Now, having done a lot of flight tests over the years now, and developing this, what the original line is, and I know why I drew that line on the airplanes I drew the line. Being up here, that's bad. It means fatigue, it means lower climb performance, all of those things. Over here terrifies me, because I know I lose control of the aircraft over here. So this is, in the Super Cub, typically when we're overloading them, we're overloading them aft. So for this, you know, if I were going to fly out the caribou antlers, you want to do it down here. So that's probably me, enough fuel to get out to another place to land, and then I'll come back for all the rest of the stuff and the other person at a later date. Make 2 trips out of it. He was only about 20 minutes from a really big airport. So there was no reason this had to happen. And one guy is unfortunately dead. And a good person and a good pilot that made a mistake. But that aft CG is what really gets me.
So I talked earlier about tying a moose horn on the jury strut, probably of a P-18, and you didn't get too much feedback there, and I said, we'll just cut it in half and put in. So how much drag does it really cause? I'm not the aerodynamic guy or the numbers guy, but Dave is. And I think you have a way of comparing this to warp prop?
Yeah. So these are guesses, because we haven't put a set of moose antlers into a wind tunnel and done a good NACA wind tunnel test. But there's a book called Horner's Fluid Dynamic Lift that I can estimate what the drag coefficient on various things that is. And I can get the area of a set of moose antlers. Now, unfortunately, because moose antlers tend to curve, you know, there's that upward curving palm, the correct way to install them is what you'll see in a couple of slides. But let's say, for the purposes of discussion, I was going to put those palm outward, so I'm like a charging moose coming at you. This is the maximum drag that you could probably get. And I run that calculation, and if I were going, say, 60 knots, with a barely legal moose, I've got about 110, 120 pounds of drag. If I've got the world record, I've got about 250 pounds of drag. Now, for example, if I were to chain a Super Cub down, put a load cell on full power with an 0320 with a borer prop, I'm probably going to get around 800 pounds if everything's tuned up and I'm getting a good pull on the prop. And it's a flat pitch climb prop. So I'm using about 1/3 of my available power to drag the moose antlers through the sky. That will mean a yaw angle on the airplane, because the airplane's going to try and yaw on me because I've only got them on one side. That means that in order to correct for the yaw, I'm going to have to step on the rudder. So I've got rudder deflection that's also causing drag. As soon as I put in rudder, what do I have to do with my ailerons if I step on full rudder to keep the wings level? I got to put some aileron in. So I've added drag in 3 different ways, 2 of which are not quite as obvious. So I add quite a bit of drag when I do this, and if they're big moose antlers and they're not oriented properly, the drag gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's the, now I don't want you to take away that this is the exact number, because I know the exact number if I had NASA's wind tunnel and I could put a set of moose antlers in NASA's wind tunnel and I could measure it directly. But this is probably a worst case of what kind of drag you might get on a set of moose antlers. Okay. So here are some of the aerodynamic effects. The flight control effectiveness may be deteriorated because you're putting a moment, either a pitch moment or yaw moment or roll moment or all three onto there. So I'm using up part of my available control. That means if I'm coming into a strip and I've got a strong crosswind, which direction do you think I should, if I have the choice of landing one way or the other, which way do you think I should orient my external load? To the left? So if I've got a crosswind coming from the left, do I want my moose antlers on the left or do I want them on the right? If I have a choice. Which way am I going to have to put an aileron? Now rudder is going to be which way? Depends on which way the airplane, if I'm rudder limited in that particular airplane, I may want one thing because if I've got to cross control the airplane to slip to landing, I may be, in some airplanes I'm more limited by rudder than I am with aileron. In some airplanes I'm more limited by aileron than I am with rudder. So you'll want to feel the airplane. It may mean that you make a low pass before you come around to land. You might try it both ways and see what you can get, if you can get it straight. I'm not going to tell you which one the right answer is. Maybe Mike can tell me what he thinks he would do.
I'd probably have it on the left, but that's me.
That's probably the correct answer in many airplanes. But again, you're the flight test pilot at this point. So it's up to you, the ciliary flight test pilot, to figure it out. So have gotten some vibration problems, shedding unstable weights over the control surfaces. That'll put a bug into the controls in some cases. The biggest thing we see in the accident data, granted we've only got 3 major data points, but we've got a lot of stories and some other instances that are more anecdotal in nature, but takeoff performance is a big problem. Climb, of course, is also a problem. And if you're in cruise, if you're adding a bunch of drag, your fuel burn for the same distance is going to be a lot higher. So if you're planning a long-range flight, you better plan additional fuel stops. People are very careful about streamlining all the we use airfoil-shaped lift struts and all that stuff to minimize drags, and then we put loose antlers on them.
So we talked about airfoil to start. So that horn weighs 64 pounds. How do I know? Because I waited before I put it on that airplane. The plane was taken, picture was taken up at Richard Pulley Strip, there, Shondell Acres, and I believe Scott Hadley on that aircraft at the same time. So you take a look at this horn here, and you say to yourself, wow, that's pretty nice. I'll go ahead and put this on the aircraft. And if I turn these paddles inside, that means more weight towards the center of the aircraft. To me, that means less aileron that I'm going to need, right? Makes sense. I would have put it on this way. But the reason we do put it on this way is because we care about the tail. Remember, one more time, we talked about the whip line. Gentleman trying to get certification, that didn't work. We know that these make the airplane go up and down. So that is the correct way to put it on. It doesn't seem it. So when you're gritting your teeth, go ahead and cut it in half. And Dahlberg will put it together for you. I think it's $35 he charges.
And you can always take a picture of it with a tape measure for the fishing game.
Oh, yeah. Well, they've gotten a little bit better at that. So 64 pounds, right? Not much, is it? 3 cases of beer out on your jury strut. How many people do that? Yeah, pretty large horn. I almost drug it in. How many people put 3 cases of beer out on their jury strut? No one.
Only
You-
if there's 3 on the other side.
All right, fair enough. But we're gonna get to the other side. What do we do if we're in a 60-degree bank turn? How many G's do we have?
Twice.
Twice. How much does that beer weigh?
Oh, it's gonna be twice as much.
Yeah. How about that?
64, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 128.
128. That's a lot of cases. That's 6 cases of beer on that jury strip. So you say, well, I just don't make 60-degree bank turns. What do you do if you're flying out there and there's some clear air turbulence and it's 2 G's? You just put 128 pounds on your jury strap. So, might want to think about cutting in half when the developer got it. But I agree, it does look much cooler on there. Flight control cables, you saw the snowshoes tied on a little earlier. If you do have snowshoes on there, you're going to tie something on. The best thing to tie them on with this stuff is right here. It's the bungee. The wing cover lady sells it, or I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. Try to run it through what you're tying down. I think that's kind of a common sense issue. Watch the control cables, be kind of careful about that. But remember one thing about bungee. Bungee is what's called rubber bands with some coverage over it. You can see it right here, and here's your rubber band. Ever go in your desk 2 years later, 3 years, find a rubber band, you go pick it up, and it just falls apart. So it looks great on the outside. It's not good on the inside. You might want to think about changing that around. Great stuff, great ways to attach things. I wouldn't say anything bad about it. Be careful with that. And if you do leave it out in the sun, we all know sun is going to rot your rubber bands. So it's the same thing we have on our hydrosobes, on our P-18s, and a lot of other aircraft. It's the sun that gets them. That's why we cover them. Take a look over here at the left. Here's a P-18 at Lake Hood. Looks pretty nice external load to me. It's got some 12, 14-foot lumber on there. Tied down pretty nice. I know there's a few people around here who know about P-18s. Basically, on float, you can haul somewhere close to 500 pounds. That's if you're pretty light to begin with. That's if you're 1,750 gross, so it looks pretty good. You can tell there's a person in the back there who's doing a slow taxi down the canal, and you can kind of look at the floats, and they're a little bit underwater, so there's probably a pretty good load in there. I call that a very good external load here.
And he's also taking some care to block them up off the control cables, off of the top of the floats. So he's not going to mess up his water rudders or his cables.
Okay, Dave talked about that piece of paper that we didn't want to go to the FAA and try to go get and all that stuff. I'm insured with Aventco, been with them for quite some time. In my commercial business, I was also insured with them and a couple other underwriters. They said if you have an external load certificate and are operating with that certificate, still at a standard, you're covered by our insurance. That was pretty good to hear. I don't know if things have changed, but it always seems that when you're trying to do something, things can kind of get a hold of you. The little propane bottle on there, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that little bit of effort that Dave was talking about, getting that restricted thing, it's going to keep you away from that thing. Plus, it's the right thing to do. Flexible loads, we all want to go over to Costco or places and buy those canoes, right? Those Coleman canoes, I call them cheap ones. They sell about $300. Almost the worst thing you can haul on an airplane right there. I know it's a pretty old picture, but it still rings true. What happens is this was tied on by ropes here, and it's a type of plastic here, and there's a tubing in here that forms the support for the canoe. And as you fly along, they loosen up. You will find most of these that are out in the weeds there still stay out in the weeds. Nobody wants to bring them back. A lot of the folks around here won't fly these loads anymore. So what seems very, very simple, very, very easy to do, could cause you some trouble if you don't have some experience. If you don't know how to do these things and you're going to do them, go over, get the certificate, go over and talk to those guys that do these all the time. They'll tell you the do's and don'ts. Don't worry about that.
Rigid insulation is another issue with that, because if the insulation panels do this in flight, you're probably coming down. You may not like the location.
Yeah, so go ahead.
If you have the handyman's secret weapon over there,
Yeah, I do.
do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so what Dave is talking about here is, let's say you want to take some metal roofing. Pretty easy to put on, right? You want to take it out to your cabin and put on the spreader bars, right? It's going to be the front, right? When you go to take off, and you get about 60, 70 knots, maybe that starts the fish mouth up a little, right? That's not a good thing. It wasn't a good thing for the guy at, not Wolf Lake, Anderson Lake. It was about 15 years ago. So how do you take care of that? Y'all got duct tape, right? Just put a piece of duct tape over the front, and your lumber won't come up. It's kind of like we talked about the fellow hauling the, I see you smiling there, Richard. You have some problems with this once upon a time? No, not me. But that'll do it. The duct tape will do it. Sure, you can throw a strap around it. Well, we're talking about straps. Straps are not all the same. There's a company that makes these straps. They're called Ancra. They're very, very good straps. If you ever want to see what's the difference between a good strap and a bad strap, take a look at the teeth inside. More teeth, the better. Obviously, it's going to grip more. But be careful. The strap will pull one way. You think you have it latched, and not the other way. You can't pull this the other way. It's 18,000 pounds or something like that. Today's straps we use are the ratcheting style that are on there. They're a little bit more popular. You can get a little crank on them, but you can get a little bit too much crank on them too. So be careful you don't bend things. It's pretty easy to do. If you take a look at this canoe and you say, should it be on the other side or should it be on that side? Anybody weighing in? So the door, okay, right? Yeah, the door's on the other side. Pilot side, the 206, right, is on the left side. We all know that. We've driven by the lake a million times here. They're still the same. So I think that's probably on the correct side. Because if you're the pilot and you need to get out, you can get out. And you never think you're going to need to get out until something happens, and then it's a different story. So just think about those things, not blocking exits. If you did have another passenger in there, or quote a crew member, you may want to put it on the other side. The downfall of it being on this side is harder for you to see when you're flying. Dave, you had something to say about straps?
Not so much, well, there's two things. So one thing about straps, if you go to somebody like Ancra and get really good quality straps, you know that that load rating actually means that somebody has tested it and it passed. If you go to straps that are made in certain countries that have not very good quality control systems, you see a strap that's rated for 1,000 pounds, but you actually test it and it makes it half that. So watch the quality of the straps, because there are some very significant differences between quality from good quality stuff and not. The other thing you could think about here is a lot of float airplanes that are operated on floats, especially amphibs, have got a little mirror here, little convex mirror out on the lift strut. Those are great for being able to have your cake when needed too, because the downside of this side is you can't see from the pilot seat, you can't see very well. But if you put a mirror there, you can still get out, and you can at least monitor it to a certain extent with the hot mirror.
The other thing, when you tie that canoe on, be a little bit careful. Notice how it's tied a ways back here in front of the prop. Remember those flexible loads I'm talking about? You move forward and back. This is not a flexible load that you want to guard against forward movement too. Oh, this is a long story. Craig Eld used to own Regal Air, and we had a discussion here at Lake Hood. In fact, there used to be an office here owned by Alaska Air Guides, and they had 206s, and they couldn't get off the lake with the same load that the 185 came off. And Craig told me, and I don't know if it's true, he says it's the straight tail operates better than the swept tail. And I thought, no, he's just sending me down the trail. But if you look at a Beaver, it's a pretty straight tail. If you look at P18, it's a pretty straight tail. You look at Lambert's 185, pretty straight tail. 206s, 182s have the same little harder time. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but just 2 cents.
I heard the straight tail is more spin resistant, easier to get out of the spin versus swept tail. Why that is that?
I know from a flight test standpoint, they both will recover, but because of the weight, when you're in a spin, the airflow is coming up at you because you're stalled and you're rotating, of course. And the swept tail tends to have more of the tail back in the weight behind above the horizontal tail. So you tend to wipe out more of the effective rudder and the effective vertical tail straightening effect in the swept tail airplanes. Now, they both meet the minimum standard, so I think they could probably be argued that it's good enough. But when we do these, especially float kits, we get to investigate this issue with vertical tails a lot. And You'll notice a lot of these airplanes on floats will have to put ventral fins on them, and that's to stabilize the airplane directionally. And so if you do things that destabilize it, and we're already struggling and we had to put this big vertical or ventral on the airplane, and then we further destabilize it, that can eventually, if it gets big enough, can be a recipe for a problem. If you have vertical, anything that's got a vertical fin to it, you want that vertical fin back, not forward. Because if you had like another airplane fuselage or anything that's sticking up vertically, you don't want that ahead, because as the airplane starts to weather vane, it'll catch you and bring you around. So that's a destabilizing effect of yaw. In flight test and airplane design, we have a concept we call vertical tail volume, which is the product of the area multiplied by the distance from the center of gravity. The larger that vertical tail volume is, the more stable the airplane is directionally. Sometimes on floats it can be too stable, because you may be trying to taxi or step taxi or something like that to get yourself lined up to make a takeoff run, and you're trying to go crosswind, and the airplane keeps wanting to round up on you. So it is possible to have too much tail, but in general, for fixed wing external loads purposes, you probably want to avoid vertical surfaces that are forward of the center of gravity. Put them after the center of gravity instead.
Is this information published anywhere?
No.
Right here tonight. And in Fairbanks a couple months ago.
This comes from lots of years of flight test and experience.
I've had a lot of friends and a few enemies that have done this for a living quite a bit, and the stories are pretty sound on how to do this. And again, I don't know if that tail makes a difference or not, but this gentleman was very, very well respected. So there you go. Congested areas. Can't fly over congested areas with external loads, right? Why not? Well, it just kind of doesn't make sense. So if you live at Lake Hood here, you're going to have to take off to that direction. I think it's a west or a north. You're not going to be able to go to Merrifield. You can go to Birchwood. Congested area, we know what the definition of that is, right? I'll give you an example of one. 3 weeks ago, we had one in Palmer called the Palmer State Fair. Today, not a congested area. So try to think about it that way. In my career, we found one four-wheeler out in a swamp with no tracks or that. We swore somebody fell off the airplane. And the reason we thought it pretty well fell off the airplane, there was no tires on it, so. I don't know how he got that far without tires, but he did. I went out with a helicopter and ended up dragging it out, Lambert. That's why I know about that one. So that's kind of hunched maybe what happened there. So congested area, there are some special, thank you, Mark, special procedures for conducting that. We talked about securing the front end of that metal with tape. You don't need to do it with those 2x4s are on there. But if you're going to haul some trim lumber on there or something that's flexible, try to secure the front end. You could just wrap a strap around it if you want, but duct tape works pretty damn good. Metal roofing, as I said, has gotten very, very popular. Just make sure you secure the front end. I talked about some trim lumber, some small stuff. Let's say you want a nice cabin, you want to haul some 10-foot trim out there. You're not probably going to want to put tape around it. Put a plastic bag around it, tape around it. It's the same thing. It's not going to fish mouth up, right? There's a lot of ways that these can be handled. Good things can be done in this direction. You kind of gave it away a little earlier. That's good on you. 1 foot of lumber is 1,000 pounds. Doesn't matter if it's 1-inch lumber. Doesn't matter if it's half-inch lumber. 1 foot is 1,000 pounds. So we talked about the 185. Pilot and passenger, 500 pounds, 300 pounds, or 200 pounds of gas. That breaks you to 700, and 1,000, 1,700. I don't know too many 185s that'll haul 1,700 pounds. So think about what you're doing there. Doesn't look like much, just like that 2 inches on at 200 pounds. Doesn't look like much, but we all know because we picked that stuff up before. Again, some old time pictures. I was going to change them out, but you know what? They still tell the same story. Large frontal area, Dave talked a little bit about that. You are going to use a little bit more fuel, so if you go out to like caught passing, it takes you 2 hours to get out of the P18, and you've got another tank with 2 hours, and then you shoot that moose, and you went out in a no wind and come back in a no wind, you're not gonna make it. You're gonna get the land a little bit short. I, at one time, had a couple of moose, put one on one side, one on the other, airplane wouldn't fly. Didn't know why. Put the moose horns all on one side, flew away fine. We know why now, don't we? Blanking out the tail. That's exactly what I was doing. I didn't know that.
So that's the correct way to.
That's a very good, safe way to do it. As you can tell, you can't see the stabilizer back there, but you can tell it's pretty clear. But I had these both on there, and I had them towards the aft. They weren't on these whip lines. They had a set EOs. And the airplane just wouldn't go. One tough thing about external loads, and you're not going to like to hear this, they like to get off the water or the land, but they don't like to climb. And my guess is that's a little bit what happened in the Rome River there with Scott. If you want to take some big windows out to your cabin, there's ways to do it. You notice there's a lumber rack on here. Well, you can get an STC for a lumber rack, or one of the guys will give you a field approval to put it on. Still don't mean you got the pink piece of paper. You got to come back and see this again.
Actually, there isn't an STC for the lumber rack yet.
Yeah. Oh, there is none?
No.
I thought that was one.
That has not been issued
Okay.
yet. So
Okay,
we
good
don't have
enough.
the approved load rating for the lumber rack,
Okay.
but there's a lot of experience for people who have done it in the past.
So the neat thing about this is if you want to take a window out to your cabin or something, there's a way you can do it. Just build a frame around it, go ahead and put it on your lumber rack, and fly away. No big deal. No big deal at all. Try to re-inspect your load. Today's world, we got cell phones going off 10 minutes. Mine's went off 5 times, and I'm not a big cell phone user, so something must be up. It seems as though it's pretty easy to get distracted. You have somebody help you or something like that, and you forget to put a clamp or a bolt in or something like that. So in the case of Barry Stanley here, this is a picture of his airplane. He's got a couple sheets of 3/4 plywood. He's got a nice window in there. He's able to take out the fellow there. The thing about these lumber racks here, there's a couple ways to haul this lumber. Take a 4x8 sheet, put plywood. We looked at it on that float, right? 1,000 pounds, right? How about if you turned it sideways? Still weigh 1,000 pounds. Your CG would be further forward. And I'm almost willing to tell you, because I know this. You put a little metal over there, or an old leading edge cup for wearing these wrecked airplanes, screwed it on. You actually have a wing, another wing under your airplane. So a lot of people carry the plywood the lengthways. If you just turn it around, you make your life a lot easier. Think about it.
Now, if you do build a wing under your airplane like that way, think about the incidence angle of the wing in flight. So you've got your main wing, the one that Cessna or Piper built. It's got a certain wing incidence angle, so you're flying along with a certain angle of attack. If your plywood, your biplane wing down here, if it's 4x8, you know, you can think about how much area that is, but it's going to be about 1/3 of the wing area of a Super Cub. If it's at an angle equal to the incidence angle of your main wing, but it's downward, it's going to cancel out about that much of your wing lift. So if you want it to help you, you want it to be about the same angle that your main wing is, and not hurting you. So that's one of the things that's sort of nice about the Atlee Dodge lumber racks is they sort of give you a little bit of a help getting that angle right. But you want to think about the effects of that airfoil on your airplane, because you're putting another not very good wing on your airplane.
Yeah, if you put 4.5, 5 inches on this mall, that's about all you need. Because we know how much that weighs, right? We all know how to do math. I'm going to back up a few slides here. Dave dumped a couple slides out of here, but I want to make a little point about something here. Maybe I dumped them out. That's probably
I
it.
think we may have dumped them out.
Yeah, so anyhow, in the advisory thing, yeah, you need to have that restricted in there. I think if you probably look at that, you know that it's external load. So everybody asked me when I first started working for Flight Standards, they said, what do you know about external loads? And I said, I don't know. Anyhow, we went around the thing and they says, well, I said, let's go put a 100-pound propane bottle on a Super Cub. You can't do that. And I said, we can too. Because this is how we used to do it. I'm not saying this is the smartest thing in the world, but it can be done. So what you do is you take the cap there, You tie that up to the cabane, and you take the back and you tie it to the float plane, or the float fittings, right? Great idea. 100-pound propane bottle, right? You guys know what all that means, or gals? You know what that means? It means there's 100 pounds of product in there. It means the bottle weighs 80. So it's 180 pounds. That's quite a bit of weight to have down there, isn't it? And so the good thing about it, when you decide that you want to go to the moose camp or wherever you're at, and you're the pilot or the guy hotshot because the weather got nice and you're heading up there and you decide you're going to fly along with your external load and your little pink piece of paper in there that keeps you safe. And now you come to moose camp, you decide you're going to descend in there, right? So you're going to nose down, right? What happens to the airspeed? Man, it starts building, right? What happens to that propane? 100 pounds, it moves forward. That's okay, right? Man, I'm really going fast. This is good. I'm going to give them a good buzz job, right? Because these things do happen, believe it or not. And so buzz job always looks better with a turn, don't it? So what happens when you come down, pull up and turn? Where does your 100 pounds go? Shifts back again. So be careful when you start to do some of these things. I did this for a fair amount of time up in the Wrangles. It was a short flight, maybe 20 minutes. Probably not the smartest thing to do. Where the gal said, why didn't you buy some of those aluminum ones and put them in the back? I said, well, we just thought that was a better thing to do, kind of like tying the rack on. So I wanted to make that point.
But you should be able to grab a hold of that thing, move it sideways, shove it pretty good, move it sideways. If it stays put, that's good. If you should be able to lift it up, push it down, push it forward, pull it back. Do those kinds of tugging on it before you leave to make sure it's really secured and doesn't start to move. And those CG shifts in flight are not fun.
So when you do get the permit to go over there at Farewell and get the bison this winter, this is the way you get your snow machine over there, 'cause it's not very fun walking around. There is a lesson I did learn from this, by the way. You see there's no windshield on there, don't you? It wasn't because I took it off, it was because it blew off. So take the windshield off. This was kind of put on by some complicated means. We took a float strut and welded it down there. But the real important thing is do get that little piece of paper. Take a piece of paper. It may seem silly at the time, but it's not so silly. Because what happens is when you start looking through this advisory circular, you're going to find out there's a lot of things that Dave and I talked about here tonight and that you kind of know about. So that's going to be a good thing. Start with small loads. Forget that 1,000 pounds. Make a couple trips out there. Check with pilots who've done a similar thing. I can tell you that guys down this road here, who I know very well, would be glad to tell you what not to do. And we talk about the stabilizer. Keep that clean, huh?
How long does the external load permit last once you get it?
Excellent question. It lasts you forever as long as you loan that airplane. When you get rid of that airplane, we take it back, you're going to surrender it. So it kind of makes sense because why we needed that pilot qualifications. So now we've got the pilot qualifications from you. We've got the airplane. You're certificated with a PIG certificate. You sell the airplane, just bring the PIG certificate into us. Don't operate in marginal VFR. I think we kind of made it pretty obvious with the case of beer and the 64 moose pound how much that would weigh out there on the jury strut, and I think none of us would do that. And I think if we thought about that, it would be pretty easy not to do that. Just because you have an external load permit and operate in the restricted, still you got to play weight and balance guy. You don't want to be that guy way out on that end of that envelope. That guy didn't have a chance. And as Dave said, and I actually know him, I think you might even know him too, Richard. Just a great guy, but he just didn't have a chance. You can't win that game. Long ago, I was told not to carry bed springs on an aircraft, so I did, but it didn't work. And what happens was, years ago, the military used to sell all those bed springs, and we used to take them out to the hunting camps and tie them on there. The airplane just won't fly. It just won't even fly. It won't even get off the ground. Over tighten the straps. We talked about that. A lot of tension and torque on there. You take the flying wires on your P-18 or your 185 or whatever you fly, your 180. You can actually take on a frame and actually turn those wires too tight. You'll actually bend the frame. Could show you anytime you like. Brad Chapman has a set up there at Anderson Lake. Stop in and see him sometime. And he'll show you how to over-tighten. He's got them on it, and you can watch the frame bend. So be careful with these things. They're made this way for a reason. I can guarantee you this, that manufacturer who built that Super Cub, he didn't want it at 1750, he wanted it at 2000. He just couldn't make it work. So that's why, to be at our standards, and we need that safety standard in there for some days when we are not at our best. We've kind of beat that up to death, huh?
I think so.
When things go bad, it's not bad to have a shoulder harness on, right?
Yeah. One of the major takeaways of that particular one is that when you do this kind of operation, you are entering a world that has significantly more risk. That's why it's a pink airworthiness certificate. It is a special airworthiness certificate for special pilots. That's why we've got the extra hours, and it's an acknowledgement that you are absorbing more risk. That's why it says restricted on there, and we tell you don't fly over other innocent people, and don't fly people that aren't involved in this, that aren't aware of the risks that you're taking. So you can do a lot to mitigate this by wearing a helmet, getting a good 3-point shoulder harness or 4-point shoulder harness into the airplane. Because anytime you fly out in the bush and you do this kind of stuff, you're accepting more risk. So it's a good idea to do some things to mitigate that risk.
Any external load questions? I know how that works. It's always afterwards or kind of a week later. So feel free to email, call, contact Lambert.
Wouldn't it be preferable to carry the loads underneath the aircraft? And there's all these belly pans pods that you can have with their attachment points, so there's a way to attach it. It will be harder to load, but you wouldn't have all these lateral problems and lighting out the elevator.
Yeah, and that's actually getting pretty common. A lot of people are taking canoes, not canoes, kayaks, putting them under 182s. I saw one the other day under 172. And I talked to the guy, says, how's it flying? He says, fine. He says, I just kind of tie it on, make sure it doesn't move and all that stuff. So yeah, it's getting a lot more popular. A lot more popular way to do it, kind of like that propane bottle that we didn't like. But the concept is correct.
It will be directionally a little less
Yes, sir.
stable, but for the rest of it,
Yeah.
If you put it longitudinally in the right spot, the nice thing about in the center line is you don't have that yaw going on. That helps. And if it's behind, if most of it's behind the center of gravity, then it's stabilizing directly instead of destabilizing. That's also good. Obviously, like the 180, the 206 pilot found out, watch the exhaust because it can burn. And they think about what that exhaust gas temperature gauge is reading. It cools a little bit from the exhaust gas temperature gauge to the output of the tailpipe, but not a lot. And so think about where that exhaust is going. There's a reason you have to clean your belly periodically. But having said that, it is a good place to put it in a lot of ways, maybe the least risk place to do it. And you can protect things with heat shields as well, like Mike mentioned.
Any other questions in that area? Nothing? That's it? Richard, come on.
I do have one comment, and you
Please.
mentioned the flying wires,
The rear flying wires?
the flying wires on floats underneath the plane. You
Yes,
don't
sir.
ever want to tie anything to one of those flying wires. Because they're only good intention. If they have any perpendicular loads on them, the strength is gone. And that's why nothing is supposed to ever touch a flying wire.
Well said. So good point, and that's why we need that interaction.
So we should probably add that to the.
Yeah, no, that's
That's a good. That's a good.
that's well said. So we got about 15 minutes left. Dave's going to talk about some mechanical deficiencies that he's seen in some airplanes.
One question.
Oh, yeah.
Unless I missed it, I didn't hear you mention operating limitations.
Yes, we did. We talked about operating limitations as in the requirement for 50 hours, make and model 250 time private pilot.
Written down, keep with you, taking the airplane?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you get your fixed wing external loads restricted category worthiness certificate, there's a set of operating limitations.
Yeah, you,
Come along with that you're supposed to follow.
I even got a set. Something I'm supposed to
You're
do.
actually required by rule to follow.
And if you're really interested in this, or not even interested in, take one of those next time you go to the dentist, read it or something. There's some interesting stuff in there. There really is. I mean, it was put together by, maybe I should say it was edited by flight standards people, but it was put together by you guys, the community. I mean, you guys are the people doing the flying all the time. You know this. You know these things. Yes, sir.
What's the average amount of time it takes for somebody that meets the requirements to process it?
2 hours.
That's it.
I've seen it done in less, I've seen it done
So you
in
know-
2. Usually what happens is you bring your logbook in and the inspector will look at it, might find a little error, and you say, well, why don't I go fix that? Like no transponder sign off, or a multitude of things, or a date missing or something like that. So it kind of gives you a free look at things. I mean, it's
They
a,
don't
just a,
come out and look at the airplane or?
no, there's no reason for us to look at the aircraft. But I know inspectors have gone on scene to do it, yes. They have gone. So just call in, make an appointment. I know it sounds simple. I know we're not easy to get an appointment with. We're not. We're like the dentist, you know. It's hard. But, you know, give us a little patience in that, and I think you'll find people that are qualified. If you have a problem in that area, get a hold of me. I'll line somebody up for you. They're good at our office about that, don't you think, Dave? And what we want to do is line you up with somebody who knows the program, not somebody who you're educating them. Yes, sir?
Could you clarify that one more time about not for hire? You seen 135?
Yeah. You had to open that box, didn't you? Pandora, you know? That's like going 75 on the Glen. You don't tell the officer you're doing 75. In the guidance and our policy, restricted load in the state of Alaska for external load. You don't want to confuse them. External load is the key word. Can't be used, or excuse me, that operation can't receive compensation or hire. So earlier, I probably breezed through it because sometimes I get a little fast. When I was in business, those guys came over and asked me, well, how do you do that? How do you charge people? I said, well, I charge them for tying it on. And he says, well, okay. How about if you're going further? I said, well, I charge you more. But I just have to make sure it's secure longer. So we're working that. There was a gentleman here earlier that actually has a lot to do with this, and he's working on that. We're trying to get that moved around with the people in DC, but we want to be a little bit careful because we don't want them to say no. Because when they say no, we're going to lose that battle. We're going to have a hard time winning that battle, guys and gals. So right about now, that hasn't been uncovered. I'm sure that's probably why Kyle left.
So
But
realistically, you could go to a flight service person over here and have him haul up a boat for you over there.
Whatever they do at this point would be.
And just not pay him because he's not
That's
supposed to.
there you go.
be there.
There you go. The deal you work out with him is the deal you work out with him.
An individual that happens to have a 135 certificate can fly the airplane for their own enjoyment under Part 91 if they're not compensated for operating the aircraft with an external load. So if they felt like doing it and was not compensated for that, they could operate under Part 91, not 135, even though the airplane might be owned by a 135.
Yeah, see, he even makes it more gooey than I do. Just say charging the time on a load.
We understand.
Okay, thank you. But we're trying to work through that for the benefit of everybody. So thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Center of gravity. If I was gonna be hauling and putting this load on my plane,
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's somewhere. I'm probably gonna put that fuselage on something so I can know where its balance point is.
Yeah.
If I figure out where that balance point is, I put it between my spreader bars, centered within my my envelope.
Not necessarily. What your first step is find that balance point, put it on something, rocks, and find out where that center of gravity is.
Mm-hmm.
Then find out where the datum for that airplane is. So like on a Super Cub, the wing leading edge is 0. So with the airplane in the level flight attitude, so the tail up, the firewall is plumb, then the wing leading edge is 0. And so for a Super Cub, that gives you where 0 is, and then if you're adding that item, the arm is wherever that balance point is aft of the 0. Now I'll give you a little bit of a tip. Most airplanes, our center of gravity limit is no further aft than 25% of the wing chord, and no further forward than about 5% of the wing chord. So that center of gravity sweet spot is going to be in this first little bit of the wing leading edge. So the center of gravity on most airplanes. Now, when you get to swept wings, all of a sudden the wing is sweeping, and that gets a little harder to calculate. But what you want to do is get that center of gravity somewhere about that sweet spot. So we usually zero all of the math at the quarter chord, and so that's a quarter of the way from the wing leading edge to the wing trailing edge. So the Super Cub, that's a 60-inch chord. So if I took a measurement to level the airplane, drop a plumb bob off the leading edge, that gives me 0. And I come back, what is a quarter of 60? That's the 25% chord. So I'm going to want to have my fixed wing external load in that area of the center of gravity.
On a cover assessment, typically, wouldn't that be about where the spar is?
The quarter chord is usually pretty close to the main spar. Some airplanes it's a little farther forward.
The spar, okay.
Yeah. So on a typical 2-spar wing, usually the main spar is on the older generation of airplanes with the older airfoils like a Cub and the 180s, 172s. Their main spars were usually around 21 to 22% chord. The later model airplanes that had the natural laminar flow, it may be more like 35% chord because the wing the wing airfoil is shaped different. So the spar is not usually where especially because there's some airplanes that have 3-spar wings, and then that rule just doesn't really work because then the spar is usually around 50%.
Yeah, that's why I just said on Cubs and 180s and stuff. That's good.
On Cubs, I think there's main spar is about 21, 22% chord. So it's not a bad place to just try and get your fixed wing external load center gravity.
But that can be measured from the data on my weight and balance on my panel.
Yeah. If you need another good spot, usually the baggage compartment or if you look in your manual, you'll have a center of gravity for your seats and your fuel tanks and your baggage compartments. Depending on which airplane you're in, those usually provide good reference places for where a certain datum point is. But if you go to the type certificate data sheet for the aircraft, it'll tell you what the datum is for the airplane. And the Super Cub, it happens to be the wing leading edge. Some other airplanes, it's 60 inches ahead of the wing leading edge. It varies a lot depending on which airplane you're in.
Any more on those?
Do we do a little bit of, do we have enough time to do a little bit of accidents from maintenance? Do you guys want to hear about that?
How about 10, 15 minutes?
Sure.
That we can get home in the sun? I could stay all night.
I'll get a little bit of,
I'll load a Cub.
going. That's how the load of Cub out of.
No,
This is-
considered a like mechanic and a pilot anyway.
There you go. I can go in the right way there.
Okay. So, I was going through the accident statistics a little while ago, and this last chunk, we had a pretty good chunk of mechanical failure accidents. And this is a random collection. Some of these are mechanical failures that the mechanic did something wrong, but some of them are mechanical failures because the pilot did something wrong. So this is the ones that have happened since since October of 2015 through when I collected the data on April 1st. So we've had, 6 different accidents. The most recent one, the ailerons were jammed for some reason. We don't know why, but the ailerons were not functioning. It was a fairly serious injury accident, but fortunately nobody was killed. A couple of things when we look back at the statistics from a long way back, when an airplane comes out of a major service, the probability of having a control accident goes way up. Now, if you're doing an annual on an airplane, always check the actual deflections with like a prop protractor or do what Mike is saying, make sure that your ailerons are doing the right thing, right? So when you do this, make sure your ailerons are moving the right way. The elevators are more difficult because you can move your stick back and forth, but you typically can't see what the elevator is doing back there. And so it's better to do that during your pre-flight, standing here and going, okay, what's that gonna do? Especially if somebody has had this system taken apart and put back together again. It's a very, very easy mistake to do to get the cables crossed. Tools getting left inadvertently inside the bellies of airplanes or inside wings, it tends to cause that kind of thing.
If you don't think it's an easy thing to happen, 25 years ago, Marty Selesco took off Lake Hood, just had his airplane worked on, ended up crashing on the island. So picture this, you're on the Beaver taking off tonight. It was about this time, beautiful night. You want to go left towards Kenai, right? That way? Because we're going west, left towards Kenai. I'm goofing you up because I'm opposite directions. But you are?
Yeah.
But where does the airplane want to go? Towards Point McKenzie. So the harder it goes towards McKenzie, the more he wants to go towards Kenai, right? Then the harder he wants to go to Kenai. Well, he ended up on Gull Island, crashed. Just as Dave said, you don't think about it. But the control cables were wrong. 3 weeks later, exact same thing happened at Birchwood. 3 weeks later. So when you get these mechanics working on things, take a look at it. I mean, really take a look at it. A guy I respect a lot, and a controversial guy, Terry Holliday at Birchwood, he's starting to have somebody else look at airplanes that he's worked on, because we did have an accident at Birchwood. I didn't want to take the thunder word, Dave, but it just happens, and we just couldn't believe that 3 weeks later the same thing would happen. So what are some getaways for doing that? Whether the Havilland, if you got a marker pen, make one red and the cable red before you take it off, make the other one blue. We all know that, right? But these are pretty experienced guys too, so just 2 cents.
And when the airplane comes out of annual after it's done that thing, the type certificate data sheet for most airplanes has got control surface deflections. And if you go over and you put a smart level out there and you roll your ailerons and you see, oh, okay, wait a minute, that's not quite right. Usually ailerons are mixed, so you've got a different amount up versus down. If all of a sudden it's not, the two are not, it's not dialing in for some reason, that probably means, because the stops are set and they're built into the airplane. So if you're missing 5 degrees of your aileron deflection, that probably means, or it may mean you've got them switched. And the same thing with elevators. Oftentimes they're biased one way versus the other. So that's a good cross-check to make sure that you haven't got it messed up. So, and make sure you got all the tools that you started off the job with, and so they're not left in the airplane. We also had a nose landing gear that failed to extend. One of the things that happens with these sometimes in Alaska is we tend to operate in a more extreme dirt environment that a lot of them we do. We're landing and taking off on gravel, and airplanes get dirty. The wear rates for things like landing gear go up, and so you look at the manual and say, well, it needs to be overhauled every X number of hours. I'm only 3/4 of that. Well, yeah, but that was based on flying in Kansas, and we're operating the same airplane off of dusty, dirty gravel runways, and those bushings start to wear out. And then all of a sudden, the nose landing gear doesn't extend properly because all the bushings are wear out. If you start having shimmy problems with your tail wheel or your nose gear, a lot of times that's worn out bushings and bearings and stuff like that. That also happens a lot more rapidly to us than it does out in the lower 48. And you might think, well, it's just a little bit of shimmy. I'll just back off or get the tail up. Especially on the 185s, it can cause a lot of extra damage if it really starts to shake back there. And we're seeing some cracking on stringers and line rounds in the 185s because of shimmy that hasn't been addressed in maintenance. We also had experimental amateur built Super Cub with leading edge that broke in flight. This is first flight of an experimental amateur built. This was an adhesive bonding problem. So the three most important things in adhesive bonding are surface prep, and surface prep. Now, a couple of things that you may not know about composites and adhesive bonding. If I have a surface that came off of a tool, nice, shiny, polished surface, why is it shiny?
Sells better. Sells better.
It sells better. It may be because I made my tool out of fiberglass, right, when I was going to lay this thing up. If I put fiberglass and epoxy right up against fiberglass and epoxy, what's going to happen? It's going to stick. I will now have a bigger tool because I've added more plies to it. I won't be able to get my part out. And so what you do when you're laying up composites is you take this magical silicone bearing compound and you polish that surface and you put this mold release compound in there. And it does a really good job of keeping that part from sticking to the mold. What's in the first surface of that part now? What I did is I put a chemical that inhibits the bonding between epoxy and epoxy. I put it into the epoxy surface of my part. And so that first layer of the material is now very resistant to anything sticking to it. So, what do I have to do? I have to abrade that to the point where all of the gloss is gone, and I can do what they call a water break free test. Take some distilled water, put it on there, see if the water beads up or if it wets out the surface. If it beads up, then I still have contamination. If it wets out the surface, now I've got a water contaminated surface. But I can dry that and then I can bond to it.
That's
So-
for all composites?
What's that?
That's for all composites?
I hate to say an absolute
much.
statement for all composites because I will be wrong.
But pretty much.
But in almost all tool side applications, you're going to have a mold release compound on that. And so that's what happened in this accident. Okay. For you Cessna drivers, this is an interesting accident because the guy took off going from Juneau up to Haines, filled up. That's not a very long flight. He should have had 41 gallons remaining at the point where the fuel gauges said empty and the airplane's engine quit and he was lost into the ocean. Maybe. How many of you heard of death caps in Cessnas? There is a type of gas cap. Would you like to?
No, you go get it, Dave. I don't do death.
Anyway, there's a long history of fuel caps in Cessnas. Some of the designs are prone to fuel siphoning if the gasket fails. And so there's a bunch of service bulletins that are sometimes an issue on the Cessnas. So maintain, the main takeaway is maintain the gaskets and pay attention to, if you go to the Cessna Pilots Association, you'll read about fuel caps. You'll find a lot of information. We don't know that this was the cause of this. We don't know why, but we know they took off with plenty of fuel. Apparently, he didn't lose the cap, but something happened to his fuel because it disappeared somewhere. We don't know where. Okay. I've got some pictures of this one I'll go into, and this one I will actually. Can you cycle a slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this was off an experimental cut, and this is essentially very similar to what you would see on a certified cut, and also a lot of other kinds of airplanes. The blood toxicology showed up an extremely high level of carbon dioxide in the pilot, or carbon monoxide in the pilot's blood. We went through a lot of stuff to validate that yes, it was a valid reading, and yes, it was a valid reading, and the pilot was probably lost consciousness because of carbon monoxide poisoning. This was the heat exchanger that fed the cabin heat. Now we're about to go into the winter flying season, so we'll be flying with that heat knob on. You can't always smell carbon monoxide in exhaust, especially if the engine is operating properly. So if the engine is, your mixture is set correctly, and you're not burning a lot of unburned hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide is odorless and has no appreciable smell. So the first line of defense for this is every annual inspection, pull that shroud off of the heat exchanger and look at it. And if you do that, you can see this kind of stuff. There's also a pressure check you can do. Plug it up, pressurize it. That'll show you if you've got problems. Also get a good carbon monoxide detector in the airplane, and that'll also mitigate it. Can you advance the slide? Okay. This is an airplane that hadn't been flown very much. Been sitting for a long time. Did a couple of circuits and then decided to take off on the gravel strip at Birchwood. During the takeoff, he had freshly refueled. Fuel samples were taken. There wasn't any contamination in the fuel, but it may have stirred up sediment in the tank. We don't really know for sure why the engine quit, but it quit, and he apparently tried to make a turn back to land and was unsuccessful, and he did what we call the impossible turn. So the biggest takeaway I can think of for this accident is there actually are some places in Birchwood you could put this airplane down without killing yourself if you had planned on it ahead of time. The first thing, when you get a true engine failure, the airspeed will drop very quickly. You need to get the stick forward or the yoke forward and maintain that flying speed. The first rule is fly the airplane. Then you can start putting a little mental energy on where to put it down and those things. But first, fly the airplane. Do not stall it. So in this case, he stalled it. And we don't know why. There was a large post-crash fire. Next slide. So the advice on that one is, first of all, do the maintenance and make sure that you really are confident that the engine really is going to run. Airplanes that sit a lot have a lot of problems with fuel contamination due to water. And we don't know that that was the problem, but it's one of the possibilities. Water does accumulate in fuel tanks over time. And so do a really good job. The Cessnas with bladder tanks especially tend to trap water in the wrinkles in the bladder sometimes on the bottom. So really do a good job of doing that. Now this is on the surface prep. Notice the weave here, but you can also see this little mottled. That was where the release material, when they laid up the part, they put a release film, and then they peel that up once the part's cured, leaves that contamination behind. So this was the tab. It's a little hard to see in the picture, but this is a dual fork. This piece was supposed to be in here, and notice here, it came away with some of the glue here, and the rest of the glue is in here. It didn't adhere. So there wasn't good surface finish, surface preparation here and inside this little clevis, because it's a two-sided clevis, and it's very difficult to get anything in there to really clean up that surface. So as you're getting into more and more composite airplanes, surface prep is next to godliness in terms of adhesive bonding. And second to that, of course, you got to mix the adhesives right and all that stuff. But if you don't get the glue to stick, you're not going to get a good structural product. Okay, go ahead. I think that's it. That just about. Anyway, I'm free to answer any questions.
No questions. All right, that's a good sign. Hey, thanks for showing up. Apologize for last week, the power being out. But this week we brought the sun out, so And a thank you to Alaska Airmen Association for letting us come out here and use this facility.